Hi Year 13, welcome to your first lesson of Friday. If you could please just pause the video here, work your way through your retrieval activity. Don't want you to spend any more than 5 minutes on those questions. Off you go. Okay, so question 1, list the women that attended the dinner party in Act 1 of Top Girls. So there were several women there. There was Marlene for one, Isabella Bird, Pope Joan, Lady Nijo, Delgret, Patient Griselda. Recall a quotation that demonstrates conflict between Mrs. Kidd and Marlene. So the conflict between Mrs. Kidd and Marlene occurs when Mrs. Kidd comes to the workplace and tries to talk to Marlene about her husband's feelings about not being chosen for promotion. So Mrs. Kidd calls Marlene a ball breaker. She also says, "You're not natural." Now that's a really good quotation to remember in terms of the expectations of women in society. Question 3, which poem is about a woman trying to escape from her past? So arguably you could say that Marilyn Monroe seems to try and escape from her past in some way in the poem Beautiful, but I think the main poem that springs to mind there is The Map Woman. Number 4, name a feature of postmodern literature. So that's quite an open question. There's lots of different answers there. Postmodern literature seeks to ask questions rather than answer them. There's also non-chronological order, non-naturalistic methods, fragmented characters, all sorts of things that we've studied. And then finally 5, name a piece of legislation that led to the rise of the new woman. So this was a series of laws that happened between the 60s and the 80s. Things like the availability of the contraceptive pill, the Abortion Act, the Equal Pay Act, etc. You could have cited any one of those pieces of legislation. Okay, so we're going to spend the first lesson of today preparing a plan for an exam response. So we're going to go through it step by step together. We're all going to write this afternoon a response to the exam question, examine the presentation of the female experience in the texts that you have studied. So the theme that we're going to be looking at the texts in terms of is the theme, the female experience. It might be handy to pause the video here and write that question down so that you've got it as a reference as the lesson goes on as well. Okay, so I do want you to write about sub in this poem. You'll choose a poem of your own to write about. You'll write about sub and Top Girls and you'll be comparative throughout. So we're going to start our lesson today by having a think about what does Duffy suggest about the female experience through the poem Sub. So we have some lines already picked out for us here. I came on in extra time in 66, my breasts bandaged beneath my number 13 shirt. Bandaged again, time of the month. I felt the first kick of my child whacked a century into the crowd. Motherhood then kept me busy at home till my girl started school. What do you think these lines suggest about the narrator's experience of having a female body? Just pause the video, have a think and see if you can answer the question in blue. Off you go. Okay, so Duffy makes lots of references to her female body and the management of her female body, if you like, as she achieves all of these successes. And what she seems to do is suggest that it's an additional hardship that women must suffer, but it's not limiting in any way. And so any excuses made about the female body or the female capacity to carry children as a reason for women having a traditionally domestic role are null and void in Duffy's opinion, because this character, this narrator, can achieve all successes whilst having a period, whilst being pregnant and after pregnancy and having a child as well. So Duffy suggests that the female body isn't limiting in any way, but that female suffering is an inherent part of the experience. Okay, so when you do your essay, what you're going to do is frame your essay around big ideas about the female experience in the texts that we have studied. So I've picked out the big ideas here for you. These are the 3 big ideas that your essay is going to centre around. We're going to examine the view that history seems to celebrate or favour male success, that females are those that suffer and endure, so undoubtedly you'll be able to bring something in from an essay that you've done with that title before. And also we're going to examine the big idea about social expectations surrounding motherhood. So what I would like you to do first and foremost, and again I'd like you to spend about 10 minutes on this because I want you to think quite deeply on the matter. I would like you to copy out this table. I'd like you to think about key lines from sub that relate to that big idea, and then key lines from Top Girls that also relate to that big idea. And what that will do is give you a framework from which this afternoon you'll base your essay around. So spend 10 minutes on that, off you go. Okay, so now that we've thought about our big ideas, it might be a good idea to start to think about which other poem you will write about, remembering that in this section of the exam, you need to compare 2 texts. One of them is Top Girls and one of them is Feminine Gospels as a whole collection. So you need to make reference to at least 2 poems from Feminine Gospels. So which other poem will you write about? Which other poem do you think shows something really clear about the female experience? Which other poem explores one of the big ideas that we've pinned down as our 3 big ideas that will drive our essay? So choose your poem and then explain why you've chosen that one. Okay, you might need some time to go through your anthology here, through your collection, of poems here. So pause the video and spend 5 minutes answering that question. Okay, so some of you might have found that one quite tricky because we haven't visited some of the poems since before Christmas, since a long time before Christmas, in fact. If I was to choose a poem to use for this particular essay, I think I'd probably choose The Long Queen, just because I think she shows a similar idea about female suffering and the female body and female roles in society, especially when she pins down the 4 laws of the Long Queen. Okay, from our last essay, I did note that lots of us are very good at AO1. We're good at building an argument and constantly referring back to it throughout our essay. I also noted that lots of you are using quotations consistently and examining the methods used by the writers, which means that you're also really good at AO2. But there are some things that we need to work on as a class, and one of those, something that seems to have slipped off our radar a little bit, is using AO3, which is context, and I'm going to talk to you about how to do that in a moment. Another one is AO4, where I want you to be explicitly comparative. So in our last essay, I noticed that some of us had slipped into a habit of writing about Top Girls and then writing about Feminine Gospels and not explicitly making comparisons between the 2 texts, and that will get you marks for AO4 if you can do that. So we're going to work on that today as well and planning how we're going to do that. So I'm going to go through bit by bit, and what you will end up with is a sheet that covers all of the assessment objectives, that's going to be full of knowledge that covers all of the assessment objectives. I don't mind, I've attached the PDF, so if you wanted to and if you had access to a printer, you could print off the blank sheet, that would be fine. If not, you can draw boxes on a piece of paper. Alternatively, you can just write down AO1 and then write all of your AO1 notes underneath. So as a reminder before we begin this activity, that our question is, examine the presentation of the female experience in the texts that you have studied. So AO1 begins when you write your thesis, when you write your line of argument. AO1 is all about how you respond to a text, how you pick apart the writer's big ideas. So we've already pinned down our 3 big ideas. What I would like you to do is write them underneath where you've written AO1 or in the box wherever you're writing. So write down the 3 big ideas that we were examining. The idea that, this isn't in order, so I can't remember the order now, but the idea that females are those that suffer and endure, that history seems to celebrate or recognise male achievement. And then I'd like you to use those to summarise those and to write a thesis statement, because if you've already planned your thesis statement, you'll be in a good position moving forward. So your thesis statement will start with, it would be easy to argue that. And then tell me something, a big idea about the female experience that both writers show us. So for instance, if I was doing this, I think I would write, it would be easy to argue that female characters are primarily those that suffer and endure. Okay, moving on to our AO2 box. We've already started to think about this one in today's lesson. So in our AO2 box, you're going to write down any quotations that you think will be quite useful for to answer this question. Any quotations about the female experience. One that springs to mind that you could write down for Top Girls is the idea there was nothing in my life, which shows that all of their success and achievement was tied in with their relationship to a male. Remember also to include quotations from Sub and from the other poem as well that you've chosen to compare. Alternatively, I want you to write down methods used as well by the writers. So do you think the non-chronological order adopted by Churchill, is significant in terms of her presentation of the female experience, for instance? Okay, so for our next box, what I would like you to write down is anything you can remember, anything that you think is significant in terms of the female experience about the context of the text. So you need to remember that texts aren't written in isolation, in a vacuum. All texts are a product of the time in which they were written, and the social factors, the all sorts of things, big things in history, political factors, all have an influence on the texts. And the writers can't write without being influenced by the world around them. So what significant contextual knowledge do you have that you will need to use to write about the female experience for Top Girls first and foremost? This could be something about Churchill's own life. It could be about laws and legislation at the time, literary movements that were going on. Let's recap some things just in case you're stuck. So have a go at doing that yourself now and pause. But in a moment, we'll recap some things. Okay, so the first thing I would definitely note down for context knowledge for Top Girls is that it was written at a time in which Britain had elected its first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. I would also be writing about the birth of the new woman and all of the laws and legislation that we recapped earlier in the lesson that led to that moment. In terms of literary movements, I definitely talk about postmodern theatre and how that's impacted upon the text. And in terms of Churchill's own life, she was a mother herself, and that would be significant to know if we were talking about motherhood as one of our big ideas. Also that she identified herself as a socialist and was famously anti-capitalist in her views. And that's certainly prominent throughout the text through her presentation of Marlene. Okay, now I'd like you to repeat the process and write down anything that you think might be interesting in terms of contextual knowledge for Feminine Gospels and Carol Ann Duffy. Off you go. Okay, one thing I would write down for Carol Ann Duffy is that she experienced her own success as a female because she was the first female poet laureate. She was also a mother as well. And all of the similar laws and legislation that led to the birth of the new woman and the changing expectations of women in the workplace, all of that will have still be relevant knowledge to apply to feminine gospels. So as I said, with this sheet, you're going to use it when you write your essay, and you're going to start to tick off all of these things. And what that will do is make sure that you cover each of the assessment objectives in your essay and that none of them will be missing when you write. Moving on to AO4 then, what I want us to do for this one is to practice writing some comparative sentences. So as I said, I could infer from reading your essays last time that you had you knew how to compare the texts. Sorry, not that you knew how to compare the text, but you knew what comparisons to draw. But what we need to work out on is how we can make that explicit to the examiner that we are being comparative and not writing about two different texts in isolation. So what I would like you to do is just write for me 3 sentences, both texts, both writers, and both. And I'd like you to make a statement about the big ideas that you can see in both texts. For example, you could write both texts explore the idea that history celebrates male success and excludes female success. Okay, have a go at doing that, spend 5 minutes on that, off you go. And then finally, I would like you to offer some critical perspectives. AO5 is all about different interpretations of the text. So what would a feminist interpret from these texts? What would a structuralist say about the text? And I think a structuralist reading is really interesting when we look at Top Girls, because I think that Churchill uses an awful lot of juxtaposition in order for us to understand the varying roles of the women. I think that we can understand Joyce's sense of entrapment when we read about Marlene's relative freedom, for instance. So I think a structuralist reading of Top Girls would be quite interesting, and I'd like you to make some notes on that as well in that section. Okay, so you will need these notes for the next lesson. Remember as well that you should have had your independent study session today, and so what I would like you to do for that is to use that time working on the timed essay and working through the video, because if you watch the video and follow the tasks properly, it will take you longer than an hour to do that. Okay.